Alright, so in this video we're going to discuss the Paratech Airbag Setup and the equipment that we have for our setup. So first off, we have two different cylinders that we can run this setup off of. We have our 4500 PSI cylinders that have the regular threaded connection here. There are two of these in compartment 4, the back compartment on the driver's side of the rescue. And then between compartment 4 and the exterior of the rescue, we have 16 5,500 pound cylinders. Now, the reason that we still have the 4,500 pound cylinders is because they thread directly on to our regulator for the airbag system. We only have one of these adapters that goes to the 5,500 pound cylinders. They're quite expensive, and if we do ever need to operate multiple air tools at once, we would be able to use the 4,500 pound cylinders on top of the adapter that's being used on these. We also now have the confined space air cart on the rescue, which has another two 4,500 pound 1 hour cylinders. So we should never run out of options with air. We do have these adapters also on the Quint, Engine 5.2 and Engine 5.4. So there's one at every station. So getting started, let's say we're going to use our 5,500 pound cylinder. We first want to hook up our connection or adapter to it. So we hook this up just by pushing down, and it'll click in. We can make sure that that's snapped on. And then the next thing that we want to do is hook up our regulator. So we remove our cap. If you can, throw the cap back in there so you don't lose it. And then thread on your regulator. Now, a few rules of thumb to remember when using the airbags. Each one of our airbags has listed on it its maximum tonnage. If you can see that, it's maximum tonnage, so this is a 20-ton airbag. That means it's rated for 20 tons at 1 inch of lift. That doesn't mean this airbag cannot go over 1 inch of lift, but it's only rated for 20 tons at 1 inch of lift. We also have the centers of each airbag marked. You can see that with yellow marker, so that if we're ever stacking airbags, you can center them on whatever you're trying to lift. So when we're using multiple airbags at once, we never want to stack more than 2 airbags together. We also never want to have anything on top of the airbags. So when we're using airbags, it's always good practice to initially put 2 airbags down. That way, if we lift with one and we determine that we've maxed out our first airbag and need a little bit more, we have that other airbag on top. So it's good practice to start with 2, but no more than 2. Also, when we're stacking them, remember that we want to have this smaller airbag on top of the larger airbag. And like I said, we don't want to have anything on top, so we want to use hard protection where possible underneath our airbags to give them a good base. And we'd like to protect them on the top as well if we're going into any jagged metal, but we don't want to use hard protection because it could turn into a projectile if something slips. So we do have soft protection to the right of the airbags in the rescue. It's old conveyor belt that's cut up, and that can be used as soft protection on top of this airbag. So that's it for the airbag itself. We know that this will lift 20 tons. We can now unpackage the rest of our equipment here. We have 5 different colored hoses. Generally speaking, so they all work for each purpose here. But generally speaking, a good rule of thumb is to use the black one and hook that up from the regulator to our Deadman Controller. The reason for that being, the other 4 colors here are just much more identifiable at night. So by putting the black hose from our regulator to our Deadman Controller, it's not going to be anything that someone's calling out. Whereas these hoses, we might have someone calling out up on blue, up on green. The black one might be tough to see at night, so it's just good practice to only put this one between the cylinder and the Deadman Controller. So our first thing, we've already hooked up our cylinder here. We want to make sure our connection's tight on our regulator. We can hook up the female end here to our regulator, and we have on all of these hoses we have a safety, a lock. If I spin this up, then the chuck cannot move back and forth, preventing it from coming off. So once I hook that up here, I want to spin that chuck so that it's tight, and then I can't move that hose. Now, I can take the male end of my hose, connect it to my Deadman controller, and here we want to do the same thing. Once I have this hooked up, I want to spin up my collar here, my lock, so that it's locked in place, and I can just check that to make sure it won't come undone. So we've got our air hooked up. Now we need to hook up something to our airbag. I'm going to put these hoses away for now, because I only need one. So the simplest airbag setup would just be taking the black hose to our Deadman controller, and from our Deadman controller, hooking a hose up and taking one hose to an airbag. Once it's all set up, I can turn my cylinder on and regulate it appropriately, just so that we never forget. We have the PSI written here, maximum of 118. So I can turn my cylinder on here. My gauge on the right of my regulator is reading my cylinder pressure. It's easy to tell the difference because this gauge goes up to 6,000. This gauge here only goes up to 400. So I can turn my regulator. I'm going to turn it up to 118. And then I want to make sure that I have my quarter turn valve here on so that it's in line with my hose and it's supplying my hose. Now that I have air supplied to my Deadman controller and I have my airbag set up here, I can lift. So if someone were to say up on blue, I can go up on blue. And I can go down on blue if someone says down on blue. And that's going to release the air from there. There's a gauge on our Deadman controller here that goes from green to red, so I can see when I've maxed out the pressure on this airbag. Right now it's telling me that there's no pressure on it because of course there's nothing pushing back. But if we had this under a vehicle or we were lifting something, this gauge would start creeping up to the red as it was getting pressurized. So that right there is the simplest of airbag setups. We have a few adapters in here that we can use. If we know that we're only going to be using one airbag, then this setup is perfectly fine. If we might want to use multiple airbags and we're not sure how many, it's good practice to put a shutoff valve on the end of our airbag. So this shutoff valve can go on here. I can hook up my hose. With the shutoff valve in line, I can charge my airbag. I can then turn my shutoff valve off, and I can disconnect my hose, leaving the air in my airbag. So if I want to use more than 4 airbags, because I have 4 hoses that I can dedicate to airbags, I can connect shutoff valves. So I have 4 of these shutoff valves, meaning that I can use up to 8 airbags. I can fill up 4 different airbags, leaving shutoff valves on them and abandoning them with hoses, and then I can fill up 4 more bags with hoses connected. So those are the shutoff valves. If we're in a situation where we may not want to get too close to the vehicle, we just want to set our airbag and sort of get away, then I can put this shutoff valve on the end of the hose. That way I'm not tethered to the airbag. I can move around to other parts of the vehicle or the scene, and I can shut off at the end of the hose, but I don't need to come right up to the airbag to shut this valve off. I can shut it off from 25 feet away with my hose. Other adapters in here, we have a Y, so I can hook the Y up to the end of my Deadman controller here. I can then hook 2 hoses with 2 airbags up, and I know I'm going to be filling them at the same speed. We have an air chuck here. We could use this either to fill tires if we really needed to, or if we're in some sort of very odd pinch. This could go both ways, and if we have a tire, such as a fire apparatus tire that's got 120 psi, we could theoretically steal air from there and use that for our system. That's going to be a much more rare scenario, but we have that in there just in case. We have our industrial air fitting, so this can hook up to industrial air tools, jackhammer, an industrial saw or impact driver that might be on site on a construction site. So much like our quick connects here, this is the type of fitting that you may see in an industrial area. We also have in here our Paratech regulator. So the Paratech, and this is something that we'll get more into in a Paratech class, but just understand that this is here to regulate Paratech struts for shoring, generally speaking for structural collapse purposes. And what this does is we can feed this with air, no matter, it does matter what the PSI is, but as long as the PSI, it says here, is between 140 and 215 PSI, this will regulate it down to 25. So we can hook one of our air hoses directly into a Paratech strut from our regulator. We can supply this regulator with air, and that will put the proper 25 PSI into a strut to help with structural collapse. All right, so now let's get into shutting the system down. So when I'm done with the system and I need to shut it down, I need to bleed all this air off of the system before I can turn it all off. So first thing I want to do is I want to turn my cylinder off, and then I need to get all the pressure out of these gauges and off of my Deadman controller before I'm able to disconnect all this. So I can do that by supplying more air to our system and then bleeding it out if I want to. That's one good way to do it. So I can just keep supplying this, and I can now see that my regulator is down to about 50. So this will only go up about one more time. So that's all, my regulator is now down at 0. I can bleed the air off of this. If I look at my gauge here, both my gauges are at 0, so I know my entire system is at 0, and that'll be verified by being able to disconnect everything. If I'm having trouble disconnecting any of these connections, like my threaded connection to my cylinder, or any of my quick connects, then I know I still have pressure on the system. But the major thing to remember is that as long as both of these gauges read 0, then I'm going to be good to disconnect my system. So first we start with turning off our cylinder, then while we still have pressure in our system, we need to feed that somewhere to get rid of it. So I fed that to the bag, I then bled it out, and now my 2 gauges are at 0. So I can disconnect everything, I can store it back in here. These bags do not need any maintenance. The only maintenance that needs to occur is cleaning. Unlike other air tools, they don't need oiled. There's no type of lubrication that goes with these. So I just need to disassemble everything, make sure that we are always refilling the rescue with full cylinders so that we're ready to go. And another thing that's important to remember is making sure that all of our locks are in the off position so that it doesn't mess up people when they're starting the setup next time. So I want to open all these up, all of my locks the whole way up so that they're ready to go for next time, and then just package my system up and we're ready to go. And that's the airbag system. One last piece of equipment that we have here for the airbag system is the foot pump. So this can be activated just by pushing down on the pump, pulling out on this lever here, and then it works just like a cylinder would. Obviously it's on demand, so we need to pump as our airbags are going up, but there's a gauge right here. So this takes the Deadman controller completely out of the equation. We can still use the same hoses, the same shutoff valves, and we can pump this, shut off our air when we'd like it to stay where we have it, and move on to the next one. So a seldom used piece of equipment. It's stored right behind the airbag.